Hey everyone, it's Jonathan Bailor. Today, a great show because we have someone who really has a special place in my heart for two reasons. One, he was one of the original, let's call it collaborators on the early version of the Smarter Science of Slim, gave me the time of day when few people did. And so for that, much love, but also shares my sentiment for simplicity and is also a software engineer by trade. He's a software engineer based out of Cambridge, Massachusetts, worked at MIT, now is over at Harvard. His name is Reinhard Engels, and he is also the author of a wildly popular quote-unquote diet book, but I think we'll learn it's not really a diet, called the No S Diet. And he just said, hey, engineering can be applied to any area of life. Why not apply it to eating and exercise? And I, to that, say, Reinhard, I love it. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate being on here.
Well, Reinhard, just to back up from the very get, people might say, what in gosh name is a software engineer doing writing a quote-unquote diet book?
Yeah, well, it started off as an attempt to solve a personal problem. So this was back in, I think, late 2001, I first got this idea. I've tended to be overweight most of my life, and I love food, and so sort of traditional off-the-shelf diet programs that involve, restricting whole categories of food or requiring you to be sort of a full-time, calorie accountant, they just did not seem acceptable to me. I think I would have rather just stayed overweight than resort to that. And so I came up with this sort of jokey little mantra that I call the No S Diet, which is no snacks, no sweets, no seconds, except on days that start with S. So Saturday, Sunday, and special days like holidays. And I actually came up with the rules before I came up with the exception. And my wife was the one who came up with the exception because I was very sort of thrilled that, wow, I have no snacks, no sweets, no seconds. I tried this for just like a week, and I was amazed that A, it was surprisingly not difficult, and B, I actually sort of saw results right away. And then I sort of despaired because, like, all right, there's no way I'm ever not going to be able to have a sweet again. And so my wife suggested, well, you have this first half of this jokey system, why not make a jokey exception, except on days that start with S? And that's really what transformed it from something that could last for, a few weeks to something that has now lasted well over a decade for me, and I think is going to last for the rest of my life.
And Reinhard, why do you think this is? You have some wonderful sentiment, or I would very much encourage folks to check out your website, which is the NoSDiet.com. And you have some wonderful, let's call them talking points about your various thoughts on traditional diet industry. And one of the favorite things you have that I'd love to talk to is you say, is there any scientific evidence that this diet works? And then you write, absolutely none, but I'm not aware that I have any competition in this regard. Yeah, it's a funny thing. And there's so much pseudoscience sort of floating around out there too. I like to think what perhaps is different about my system is that I don't pretend there's a whole lot of science behind it. And I actually, at first, it took me a little while because, it sort of started out as a joke. I mean, it sounds sort of ridiculous. This sort of mantra could possibly be effective. And I was surprised that it worked for me. And so I being a software engineer, I put up a website, and at the time the website was very short when it started, but I started getting comments from people like, hey, this is working for me, or hey, like, what do you mean by a snack or something, or does this count as a sweet? And I started responding to these and building out the website, and it sort of turned into a kind of essay now. So this initial tiny little mantra now has this several pages of exposition on there. And it kept taking off. I added a bulletin board, and I started doing a podcast myself. And eventually I got offered this book deal in 2008 and with a reputable publisher I'd actually heard of. And so one thing just sort of led to another.
And that is how this software engineer with no special credentials in this field wound up publishing a diet book.
Well, the thing that I think actually fits perfectly with engineering is, in the field of engineering, my perception is results matter a lot. And I know that sounds stupid, but if you build a bridge and it falls down, that's a problem. And if you build a piece of software and it doesn't boot, that's a problem. However, for example, a physician can tell you to do something, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't matter, right? So I think engineering is actually a really interesting field to look at when thinking about how to design systems, as you call them, that we can maintain for the rest of our lives.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you mentioned results too, because I think that a lot of times people get fixated on the wrong kinds of results. Like, for example, I find very quickly with diet, people are fixated on these sort of immediate losses, and they sit there and they stare at the scale in the morning and they stare at the scale at the evening, and they're distraught if there's some unaccountable difference there. And what I recommend instead is to really just focus on my favorite metric is days on habit, or even better, years on habit, to try to build these strong habits over a long course of time and focus on that as your primary metric rather than the weight loss results you achieve. Not because those aren't important, but because the behavior is primary and it's something that's directly within your control. And I even like to frame the problem a little differently than it tends to be framed. People often come to diet and exercise and they think, my problem is I'm overweight. And I like to sort of break that apart and turn it into behavioral problems. Two problems. One, I overeat. That's one problem. And the other problem is I don't move enough. I don't exert myself enough. And when you look at it that way, these are problems that are guaranteed to be soluble. No matter what your sort of genetic disposition, you don't have to overeat. You don't have to not move. And so I think that's very encouraging for people to focus on that. And I think motivation is the big problem for both of these fields and lots of other fields of self-improvement. And so I like to keep the focus on behavior.
And I like how you also keep the focus on, and this is a corollary to behavior, but the focus of the ability to stick with something. And people often, this is referred to in popular media as lifestyle change, but that word has become so flaccid. No one really, it's a lifestyle change. You just throw it out. It's goodness. Like, it means nothing, but what you explained so well is that the data is clear. 95% plus of dieters, quote unquote, fail. And in some ways, studies consistently show that if you stick to any conscious way of eating that prizes health even a little bit, that is the key. Just finding a system that works and sticking to it, right?
Yeah. And so that's really that's exactly the part of the problem that I'm focusing on, which is not how do I maximize the effectiveness of whatever caloric intake or that I'm doing, but how do I get myself to actually continue to practice these good behaviors over time? Psychologically, what kind of structures can I set up to make it easy for me to succeed and hard for me to fail?
And what have you found? This resonates with me so much, not only in the, let's say, personal lifestyle arena, but also in the professional arena. I'm sure you've noticed this is in the diet and exercise arena. It's very easy to talk and to get hung up on, let's just argue about approaches. And same thing even in the work environment. We might have meetings and we might discuss work we want to do. But when it comes to actually doing it, when it comes to actually choosing what we put in our mouth and how we move our body, and when it comes to actually doing work, that is the more challenging part. And in many ways, that's the part we need to focus on, not who's right or wrong, but what is right for us that we can actually do.
Yes. Yeah.
So how do we do that? What are some of those systems?
So one thing that I think is very critical and a big stumbling block for people is you may be familiar with this quote. It's a sort of great piece of wisdom in the software world. Premature optimization is the root of all evil. I think this was Donald Knuth who came up with this, and it basically means don't focus on the fine tuning until you've sort of basically solved the basic problem. It's another way of expressing that sort of famous 80% solution, except with emphasis on the risks. Because when you look at the problem, for example, of overeating, and you start fixating on sort of little details, little tiny optimizations, like, if I eat, 18 times a day, my metabolism is like slightly tweaked, or if I, get this many antioxidants, that will be optimum. You can even hear it in a lot of the titles, sort of optimum well-being. You don't need optimum, you need good enough. You need the 80% solution. That part of the problem for most of us is just sheer quantity, the sheer mass of food that we're taking in. And on the other end, our just giant lack of exertion on the physical end. And so if you step back, don't get into these little religious wars about antioxidants or different biochemicals, but stick with these big behavioral issues, and that will solve you 80% of the problem. And then if you want to, you can go and optimize. You can optimize once you've solved the basic problem, but don't be distracted from the basic problem by these arcane discussions about how to go from good to perfect.
Reinhard, what are your thoughts on one thing you mentioned that I really, really like is having these systems and rules in place so that the actual execution is simpler. And what I'm wondering is a lot of people have found, at least in my experience, and the scientific literature seems to back this up, that if we eat certain types of foods, it's much easier to overeat than if we eat other types of foods. It's well established that different sources of calories have different satiety responses, both in our gut as well as in our brain. So certainly you mentioned overconsumption is a problem. What do you think about overconsumption being a symptom of a deeper problem, which is the type of food you're eating? A simple example, and again, this is ridiculous, right? But just to illustrate the point, if all you were to eat is spinach, it is physically impossible to overconsume that food. Your stomach would explode.
Yeah. I think there's certainly an element of truth to it. My question is, how practical is that truth? What I like to focus on, rather than the stuff that you're eating, not because it's unimportant, is the structure. What is the pattern that you're eating? To me, the biggest change in our diet is not the stuff that we're eating, but that we no longer eat meals, that we're sort of constantly perma-snacking. And this is a historically very weird, strange behavior. It's very novel, and I'm sort of surprised at how little play this gets. There's actually a wonderful study by David Cutler at Harvard called Why Have Americans Become More Obese?, where he gives data showing that 90% of the increase in caloric intake in the United States since the 70s, so basically the whole obesity epidemic, has come from snacking. And in women, it's over 100% because calories from meals have actually gone down. And so you can look at this as sort of a stuff problem. Yeah, people are snacking on bad kinds of foods. But I prefer to look at it from a structural problem, as a structural problem. When are people eating, and how to fix that. And then the stuff problem will fix itself, because when you have these limited input opportunities, it forces you to take them seriously. You've got only 3 chances a day to eat each meal right. And so you're not going to blow it on something ridiculous, because you're not going to tell yourself, I'm going to eat this, pizza and Big Mac with nary a vegetable in sight, because I can make up for it later with healthy snacks or something. And so the problems you mentioned, I do think they are real, but I think you can address them as a side effect of attacking the structural problem, which I think is primary.
And I can certainly see how, being a software engineer myself, this perma-snacking, as you describe it, is certainly endemic of professions where you sit at a computer all day long. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on this. Oftentimes people think that someone who has a very, very desk-based job is gaining weight because they're sitting all day. My observation is actually that those types of jobs seem to lend themselves to exactly what you described, which, of course, you're sitting every day, and that's fine. But if we actually look at surveys across the country in terms of, for example, manual laborers who are not sitting all the time, in fact, the opposite is true. They have no less incidence of obesity than desk workers. But the difference seems to be that there is this, let's call it Mountain Dew and chips problem, where you just drink Mountain Dew and eat chips all day.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that because of your background in engineering, you saw that, for example, this elimination of snacking at the desk, which in my own experience in engineering is a big problem, makes such a big difference? The question is basically, how much do you think your background as an engineer influenced that particular take on solving this problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think the term I like to use for this kind of practical approach to self-help, I call it habit engineering. I mean, you know, I basically I try to, as with my code, I try to reduce a problem to a few simple, clear principles and get rid of everything extraneous. So I think that aspect has certainly helped. I have to admit, when I first thought of the No-S diet, it was a bit of serendipity. I just sort of stumbled onto this thing and then thought long and hard about why the hell this was so effective. So it kind of was backwards.
And that seems, that would be my intuition as well, as if I just look at the people around me, for example, when I'm in my engineering profession, you're very correct that there's two ways to approach this. One is to say, focus on food quality. The other is what I hear you saying, which is focus on the eating occasions that seem to lend themselves to horrific sources of calories. And that is these constant desk-based, unconscious snacking, which is just general. Like if you were to just eliminate that and you were to focus on your meal-based foods, for lack of better terms, are naturally higher quality and less fattening than these snack foods by definition, right? We all know that.
Right. I mean, one of the reasons that snacking was not endemic formerly is because you know, yes, you could eat a carrot or an apple, but who really wants to, right? The reason you snack is because you want to eat the Cheetos or the bars or whatever. And, you know, if you at meals, you're going to feel ridiculous, you know, putting a plate of Cheetos on your plate or something. So there is that sort of spotlight that each meal has, which I think will solve, and I've experienced, and people report this, I think adequately addresses this issue of nutrition. Although what's nice about the No-S diet is that you can easily overlay it if you feel the need, like, you know what, I'm concerned about whatever, antioxidants or I don't know what. You can easily overlay that with the No-S diet. You can do No-S vegan. You can do No-S low carb. I personally don't find any of that necessary, but if for whatever reason, maybe it does work for you, it's very compatible with pretty much every other diet out there as well.
That's what I really like about it, Reinhard. I'm so glad you brought that up, as it really is not what you have set up. It is a system. It is a If you approach eating this way, you're in many ways ignoring the inputs, and you're just saying, for whatever input you're going to give me, if you consume them in this pattern or in this structure, there's a good chance you'll be even more successful.
Yes. Yeah. And it has other wonderful side. It's funny because it's almost like the best thing about this is all these weird side effects, which are not like directly correlated with or whatever involved with weight loss, which is the reason most people, you know, come to the No-S diet. But then they report, you know, I'm actually eating healthier, you know, in terms of quality. I'm actually gastronomically eating better. I enjoy my food more. And this is, you know, for people who like to eat, and presumably most of us who are overweight are in that category. This is a huge boon, and a lot of people, it's almost like this sort of, you know, hellish torment that we have because we love to eat, and yet we can't enjoy the food because we feel so guilty and you know, disgusted at the fact that we're overeating. So once you get that under control, it's a fantastic benefit to realize, wow, I actually enjoy this now. I can go and with a clear conscience, it's Saturday. I can have this delightful, whatever, chocolate mousse truffle thing, and it's fine. And whereas before, even though you might have eaten that kind of thing a lot more frequently, you never really enjoyed it.
I love that. I love that psychological side effects. And I'm curious, speaking of psychology, Reinhard, both of us are engineers, so maybe genetically we look at things extremely logically, and at least for myself, can sometimes need to over-index on the emotional side because I would naturally just be like, Spock, logic. You have a heading on your webpage, it's just nosdiet.com. And I've certainly gotten this question, and you frame it as, in this sense, please tell me exactly, in all caps, every single food I can and can't eat, exclamation point.
Right, yeah.
So do you tell people
it's
exactly?
Amazing, and despite this, I still get asked this all the time. Yeah, I mean, I think this is exactly the premature optimization thing. Like what the no S diet does, and where this particularly comes up is also the no sweets rule. And you'll notice it's not no sugar. There's a sort of subtle but important distinction there, because no sugar can become complicated very quickly. You start having to check ingredients and so on. But no sweet, something that tastes sweet enough for it to register as a sweet. And I call this the dessert test. If it's sweet enough to count as dessert, it's a sweet. Don't avoid it. But instead of focusing on all these borderline cases, just focus on the really egregious offenders. And that will probably be enough to solve your problem. And if it's not, you can always move further from there, but get that down first, And so that's what these rules try to help you do. And I try to insert a little humor around it to help you sort of laugh at yourself for the ridiculous excuses you're going to come up with not to do this.
I love it. When it really this section of your website really, for me, hit home the complementary nature of our respective messages. And one is my message of approaching it first from, if you focus on what you eat, overeating can potentially take care of itself, and you focusing more on if you control how you eat, overeating can take care of itself. So, and if you overlay them both on top of each other, so you're conscious about how you're eating, you're not just unconsciously putting food into your face, and you also put some thought into what you're eating within that system, might you get the best of both worlds?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I have to admit, I don't have rules that specifically address nutrition. To me, they're sort of taken care of adequately as a side effect. But certainly there's no reason you couldn't combine them both. And as you mentioned, that might, take you to the next level.
Reinhard, what is your
there's different psychologies. I'm sorry?
Oh, sorry. My apologies. I love, one of the things I love about the No S diet structure is this sentiment that meals naturally afford, let's, for lack of better terms, call them saner eating choices. The question, though, is if you look at grade school children, for example, or the up-and-comers, so people under 18 right now, I don't know if this has been your observation, but it seems that a totally reasonable breakfast is Pop-Tarts and or sweetened cereal, totally reasonable. A totally reasonable lunch is a hamburger and french fries, and a totally reasonable dinner is pizza. That's 3 meals, no stacking, no sweets. What do we say to those people?
I say it's possible to game this system. You can go and you can eat that kind of meal every day, and then if you come to me and say, hey, why isn't it working? I'm going to say, come on, that's ridiculous. And I think that the biggest problem people have is not these tremendously obvious things. The biggest problem people have is the self-deception. It's that they manage to fool themselves into thinking, like, I don't understand. I had this. I've been eating these healthy snacks and whatever. Why is this? Why am I getting so heavy? And what this does is it provides sort of a shortcut to make any excess very obvious. So, for example, if you're eating like that, you know why you're overweight. But if you're, let's say, eating healthier than that, but you're allowing yourself snacks, sweets, and seconds, it can be easy to sort of be surprised. Like, whoa, I don't understand. How did this all creep in? If you limit it then to these 3 meals with, the no sweets provision, the no seconds provision, so essentially 3 plates, you force yourself to visually confront everything you're going to eat. And when you do that, your eyes are actually pretty good at eyeballing excess. They will, at least they will become so once you've trained yourself a little bit about this. If you eat a lot, it's going to look like a lot. And that it's embarrassing. It's uncomfortable. Even if there's no one around, you feel sort of like, this is a lot of food. And that sort of gentle pressure will be enough, I found, to whittle down your portions and to boost them qualitatively over time.
Reinhard, that is just excellent, because I think the real key, the thing that I really like about your approach is studies consistently show that with calorie counting, which we both despise, if it is effective, the reason it's effective is just because it makes you think about what you're eating. So if you are going at the office to grab a cupcake just randomly and eat it while you walk to a meeting, you won't do that, or you will feel guilt for doing it because you're like, okay, now I have to write that down. And in many ways, I see the No S diet as a much simpler, sustainable, reasonable way to just make yourself conscious about your eating choices rather than having to carry around a calculator all day.
Yes, yeah, that's really what it is, and it's a way to do it as unobtrusively as possible. You can sort of fit this as easily as possible into your existing routines. It's not going to be like every time you visit someone, go over for dinner, that you have to have a separate meal or something. You can have continued. In fact, it encourages social meals because it's meal based. You don't have to. All you have to keep track of is, what day is it today? Is it, and how many meals have I had? So it's a kind of a good enough shortcut to controlling excess and nudging you towards better nutritional and gastronomic choices.
And folks, if you have the opportunity, which I would highly encourage you to dig more into Reinhard's work, which the book is the No S Diet, and the website has the same name, nosdiet.com. One thing that he does very well, which I appreciate, is distilling things down to as simple as they can be, adding some levity to this subject, and also sometimes shining a light on things that, like Reinhard mentioned earlier, this premature optimization, or sometimes we can all get a little wrapped around the axle, focusing on things that really don't matter if we take a step back. A good example of this, Reinhard, which I'd love to close on, is you have this awesome question on your website, which, if you don't mind, I'm going to share, is what if I'm an idiot and insist on following the letter of the law, but breaking it in spirit by, say, eating a gallon of ice cream every S day and counting my second cousin's hamster's birthday as an S day? What do I do then?
Yeah, and again, the point is, people, if you make excess obvious, if you do that, people aren't really going to do it. It's sort of a rhetorical question, right? Because people, I don't think, are going to be surprised if they do that they're not losing weight. And this is a sort of thing people pick at when they're sort of intellectually evaluating the system without taking human nature into account.
That is such a key. Is that I've noticed the longer I've been in this field that it's that intellectualization of some of this stuff where it can seem so complex when we, for lack of better terms, let it become complex. But as you outline here, through these systems, very simple systems you can put in place about when you eat, and when I talk about what you eat, it becoming complex seems like it's really a choice. What do you think about that?
I think complexity is a negative. You really want to avoid it. It's like the tax system. Having this complex tax system that theoretically is just, but is so complex that there's all kinds of ways to scam it. You have the same kind of thing with self-improvement systems. Plus, just the cost of compliance. Even if you are doing this PAC system correctly, this complex self-improvement system correctly, the cost of complying with these rules is so high that it's unsustainable. For most of us, we don't have a whole lot of extra bandwidth to devote to this. And a lot of us think we do when we're evaluating some diet. We're like, oh, this is so exciting. I can't wait to set up an Excel spreadsheet and track 5 different metrics about my physical performance. That's fun for 3 weeks, maybe tops. And then it becomes a chore and then people just give it up.
I love it. Well, Reinhard, what's next for you? You've got quite an interesting dual life here. What's next? Are we going to see you in some spandex in a workout video, or what?
Well, I have. You could see me in my pajamas in a workout video. I have actually a couple of exercise related or systems as well. The more notable of which is something I call shovel glove, which is a workout that you perform in your living room, not necessarily in your pajamas, but if you choose, using a sledgehammer, and you mimic kind of traditional manual labor movements, so shoveling and driving fence posts. And I think there's about 10 canonical movements, as I call them, that I've posted video of on my website. And the idea is, as with the no-S diet, to tap into the psychological part of the problem, to kind of turn it into something that's sort of fun, something you kind of look forward to as opposed to something that you dread, and to optimize it for habitualization. And so instead of focusing on, I happen to think the swinging around a sledgehammer is awesome exercise, but that's almost secondary to the psychology of it. And the most important part of that is just the timing, the temporal aspect of it. So I use the same sort of weekday, S day versus non-S day, or N day, as I call it, dichotomy to divide when you should exercise. So every weekday, except on holidays, except on S days, I do shovel glove for 14 minutes. And that's also significant because 14 is 1 minute less than the smallest unit of schedulistically significant time, right? You never have a meeting that starts, at 9:05 or 9:15, right? Or 9:14. It's always, 15 minutes is the smallest increment. And that's sort of a humorous reminder when you try to come up with some excuse to get out of this and how ridiculous you're being. And so I think that...
I love it. Go ahead, sorry.
I think that I think you could swap out the sledgehammer part for other kinds of exercises. There was recently this article in the New York Times about a 7-minute workout, right? And I'm just doing body weight exercises that supposedly is very effective. And that sounds promising. And I'm all for body weight exercises when I travel and can't take around my sledgehammer on the airplane. I will do push-ups and so on. But what's lacking there is sort of the fun part of it, because everyone thinks, oh yeah, I can torture myself for 7 minutes every day. That's no problem, but it turns out it is a problem. And so having the actual movements be somewhat fun is important as well.
And Reinhard, where can individuals learn more about Shovel Glove?
Shovelglove.com. So it's all one word, shovel and glove. And the story about why it has that somewhat strange name, you can read all about it there.
I love it. Well, Reinhard, thank you so much for joining us, folks. Again, his name is Reinhard Engels, and the book we talked mostly about today is the No S Diet. Also has his shovel glove, as we've been talking about now, and you can learn more about his approach to eating and also learn a bit more about his approach to life in general. Got a lot of cool stuff at nosdiet.com. Reinhard, thank you so much for joining us today.
Jonathan, thank you so much for having me on the show.
And folks, I hope you enjoyed today's conversation as much as I did. Another awesome look at the diversity of options out there, and really us each finding something that works with our mind, with our lifestyles, and with our bodies. So remember, eat smarter, exercise smarter, and live better. Talk with you soon.